Okay. Buck's friend Robert's home, but his mother is intubated. So, need to remember. Huh? His wife's mother's intubated. Okay. All right. Well, mercy. Okay. That's a lot of stuff. Back to the end of 2 Kings. Praise the Lord for that. That's almost there. And we're down to a day now. Of course, northern Israel's been carried off by the Assyrians. We're quite a bit past that now. We're down to the point of Judah, and Judah getting taken over by the Babylonians, which is kind of a process. The Babylonian, or we call the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar II, one of the greatest kings, I guess, ever, according to history. He is those were the Chaldeans, is who those were, the Chaldeans. And we call that the Babylonian Empire, but they're the Chaldeans, and they're the ones. Nebuchadnezzar II was the king, the great king that came down and conquered all this territory and would eventually conquer quite a bit more after this. Judah was kind of in a spot now, It was Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldeans were fighting with Egypt. Egypt and the Babylonians or the Chaldeans were fighting with each other. And if you remember right from the map, Judea is kind of down on the southern tip of that. So it was one of those places that they wanted. Of course, the Babylonians wanted, and our Nebuchadnezzar wanted. So it was a time that God had prophesied that there would be somebody to take care of him. And in the middle of that is Habakkuk. He's a minor prophet. He is 608 to 605 BC. So we're right in that time. 586, that's when Jerusalem would finally fall. But it actually started ahead of that because there was actually about 3 different sieges of Jerusalem or times Nebuchadnezzar approached Jerusalem. We'll talk about that a little bit today, this morning. So even though Jerusalem actually fell in 586, it actually started previous to that. So these are the days of Habakkuk and Zephaniah. We don't have time to do 2, but we haven't talked about Habakkuk in many years. So Habakkuk had some questions, right? He said, the prophecy, how long, Lord, must I call for help? You do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abound. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevail. The wicked hem and the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk asks the question, how long, Lord? How long will this go on? And I guess it's a multifaceted question. On one hand, it's the injustice of the Babylonians that are coming to conquer them. On the other hand, it's what's going on within Judea, what's going on within Jerusalem. God says, look to the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture, swooping to devour. So Habakkuk says, how long will this injustice go on? The law is paralyzed. Things are terrible. Got these bad kings. We'll talk about them a little bit more. And so he says, and God answers. He says, I'm going to do something that you would not believe. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. And this is what they will do. They'll siege Jerusalem and build ramps. They'll siege it. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So the Lord's telling Habakkuk about what's going to happen. And then Habakkuk asks another question. He says, Lord, you're not from everlasting, my God, my Holy One. You will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Why do you tolerate wrongdoing, right? Why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Eternal questions we ask God, right? Eternal questions. Why, Lord? Why do you allow it? And the Lord responds to him. I got to finish the question. Therefore he sacrificed to his net, burns incense to his dragnet. He is to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look and see what he will say to me, and what answer am I to give to this complaint? And so the Lord answers him, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and not delay. See, he is puffed up, his desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He's arrogant, never at rest, because he's greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations, that catches the people. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods? So he says, the faithful will remain. The faithful are going to make it. But this, you're going to be overrun. You're going to pay a price because you've done evil. And because of that, you're going to be plundered. Things are going to happen. For you have shed human blood. You've destroyed lands and everyone in them. Woe who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. And he's talking about Israel here. You've done this. You've done these things. You've built a city with bloodshed, established a town by injustice. Is not the Lord Almighty determined that people's labor is only fuel for the fire? In other words, you brought this upon yourselves. This is what's going to happen to you. There's no way around it. But yet he gives some hope in there. He says the faithful will live, right? So there is hope in this, what he's telling Habakkuk. He says this is hope in this. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around you. His disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you. Your destruction of animals will terrify you. You've shed human blood. You've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. He says, woe to him, that's these gods, false gods that you've done, that you believed in, vain idols, an image that teaches lies. Trust in their own creations, make idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? There is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. And that idea is, why do you argue with God? God set this in motion. You've brought it upon yourselves. The Babylonians are going to swoop down. I like that word, swoop down. They're going to swoop down there, and they're going to get you because I've set that in motion, and you're not going to change it. You're the one who's brought it upon yourself, not God. God's saying, I didn't do it. I didn't bring it upon you. This is your doing. This is judgment for your transgression, for your sin. It's not me. You've done it to yourself. So Habakkuk is this heralder of impendent, of doom, right? He's a guy who comes in and he says, he says this is going to happen, and there's just no way around it. The prayer of Habakkuk the prophet: Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. I renew them in our day, and our time make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk's prayer is that in wrath, remember mercy, because he understands that the wrath of God is upon them. Habakkuk is really a prophet of doom. And he's speaking at a time when God's made up his mind. Things aren't going to be changed. He's not a prophet that says you can repent and turn, you can go back. The time has passed. The things have been set in motion. Babylon, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar are on the way, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So that's kind of the message of Habakkuk. And that kind of leads us into where we're at, the doom of Judah. God's people, right? The remnant, the lineage of Christ, tribe of Judah, house of David. And now they've set their own fate in motion. And that's really where we're at in the book of 2 Kings. Jehoahaz was 23. He reigned 3 months. you can see these reigns are getting really, really short. He did evil, just like the rest of them did. But then we get into Pharaoh Nico. If you like history, you're going to like this morning's lesson. If you don't, you're going to think it's the most boring thing ever. So, Pharaoh Nico was the great pharaoh of Egypt who fought the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted Egypt because Egypt was the fertile Nile River Valley. It was very much something he wanted. So the Babylonians came down to take Pharaoh Nico. They came down to take that land in the battle, and they defeated. Actually, Nico came out to fight the Babylonians first, historically. Nico came out to fight the Babylonians, kind of fight them where they are. Nico was encouraging other nations to fight Babylon, which would include Judah. This is part of the problem. The Egyptians were a big part of the problem. So they were encouraging other nations to fight the Babylonians individually. So Nico rallies his troops, comes up out of Egypt to fight the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans defeat him. So he goes back to Egypt, and then the Babylonians decide they're going to swoop down on Egypt and take Egypt. So Nico has to defend Egypt, which he does. And at this particular point, he repels the Babylonians. So the Babylonians are kind of repelled out of Egypt. So Egypt still is in existence, and they're going to kind of look towards Judah now. So, so Pharaoh now is in Judah. Now this is going to you kind of got to keep up with this morning. It kind of gets confusing. So the Pharaoh, Egypt, has come up, and they've kind of got Judah at this particular point in history. They've kind of got Judah right now, and he imprisoned Jehoahaz, the king of Judah, that he might not reign, and he imposed on the land a fine of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Nico made Eliakim, the son of Hosea the king, in the place of Hosea his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. So basically, the Pharaoh set another king on the throne, and he imposed a huge tax on Judah, a huge tax, and basically not to destroy it. So he kind of took it in, kind of like a sovereign nation, you might say. He took Jehoahaz away to Egypt, and he died there. And so he gave the silver and gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land in order to give the money to the command of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land, each according to his valuation. And Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king. He reigned 11 years, and his mother's name was Zebediah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Ramah. So basically, at this particular point in history, Egypt is basically taking in Judah as a sovereign state. They've appointed a king they can control, and they're exacting a huge tax. And because of that, the king of Judah, who's no longer really the king, he's just somebody put in place, but he's still the lineage. This lineage has to continue. He's still the lineage of David. He's the uncle of the king that was there. He's the son of Josiah, which was a great, good king, right? And so he's imposing a heavy tax upon the people, and Egypt is kind of in control of things. And this starts that relationship between Judah and Egypt that's really going to cause the downfall of Judah. We'll get into that in a minute. So anyway, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, this king. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, which is exactly what we read about in Habakkuk, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, it says in the Bible, the Babylonians we call them. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years, then turned and rebelled against him. Okay, so this is the battle I was telling you about. So the Egyptians and the Babylonians fight, not in Egypt, but they fight outside of Egypt. And the Babylonians win. So Nico and the Egyptians, they go back to Egypt, but they're still trying to get people to rebel against Babylon. Okay? Well, then Nebuchadnezzar comes down and he takes over Jerusalem now. But he doesn't destroy it, okay? It's just a sovereign state. In other words, he goes in and he's going to do the same thing that Nico did. He's going to impose a big tax on it. He's going to control it. He's going to make it a sovereign state of Babylon. He's still going to be Judah. He's not going to destroy it yet, but he's going to impose a tax just like the Egyptians did. But then the Egyptians are telling the king of Judah, they're saying, you need to revolt against this Babylonian king, because they're trying to encourage people to revolt against Babylon, because Egypt knows that the Chaldeans are a huge threat. The Babylonians are a huge threat to their empire. So they're encouraging these nations like Judah to stand up against Babylon and fight against Babylon to try to weaken them, because they're afraid eventually Babylon will take them over, which they will. But we're not to that point yet. So anyway, they're trying to encourage it, and that's what's happening here. And at the same time, Jeremiah, which we can't really get in, we're going to get a little bit of Jeremiah today, but at the same time, Jeremiah the prophet is telling the king of Judah, he's saying, you need to pay Nebuchadnezzar. You need to pay the Babylons. Because if you don't pay the Babylonians, they're going to come in and swoop down on you and take you over, right? I really like this word swoop. It's my new word today. They'll swoop down on you and take you over. But the king of Judah, he's listening to Egypt, and he thinks, if I revolt against Babylon, the Egyptians are going to come up here, and they're going to help me. And I'm going to be able to get out from underneath the Babylonians. I don't know why he thought getting out from underneath the Babylonians was that much better than being underneath the Egyptians. But he says, I can get out from underneath the Babylonians. And if I revolt against them, which is what Egypt's trying to get me to do, then they'll come up and help me. But Jeremiah is saying, you're stupid. That's my paraphrase. Don't listen to that. Don't listen to that. You need to pay the Babylonians. But the king of Judah says, I'm not going to pay the Babylonians, because the Egyptians are going to come help us. Instead of listening to Jeremiah. Anyway, that's where we're at. Is everybody up to speed here? Has anybody got any questions? Doing the best I can. So he goes down. So he turned, and the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, the Armenians, the Moabites, the Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord she has spoken. So now, because Judah raised up and said, oh, we're going to rebel against it, then all these nations who were allies, which this is the encompassing of the Babylonian Empire, all the Chaldeans, all these are all Babylon. Okay, it's all going to be Babylon. And they're all coming down now against Judah because Judah refused to pay the tax. And so Jeremiah, I'm going to look at a little bit of Jeremiah. In the meantime, the prophet Jeremiah is prophesying from Jerusalem, because Jeremiah is a captivity prophet. Okay, he's prophesying before the captivity, and then the Lamentations of Jeremiah. If you got an old Bible, it says Lamentations of Jeremiah. If you got a new Bible, it just says Lamentations. But the Lamentations of Jeremiah are what he wrote from a grotto in Jerusalem after Jerusalem was destroyed in 586. So Jeremiah transcends that. He goes from the pre-occupation to post-destruction. That's the time of Jeremiah. That's his time. Now Ezekiel's going to come into play in just a little bit here too. We'll get into that in a minute. But he says, go up through her vine rows and destroy, but do not execute a complete destruction. Strip away her branches, for they are not the Lord's. For the house of Israel and the house of Judah have dealt very treacherously with me, declares the Lord. They have lied about the Lord and said, not he, misfortune will not come on us. We will not see a sword or famine. The prophets are as wind. The word is not in them, thus it will be done to them. Jeremiah, there's a lot of prophets in the days of Jeremiah, and a lot of them were saying, oh, the Lord wouldn't destroy Judah. Why do you listen to that? We're his people. He promised, he'll take care of us regardless of what we do. And Jeremiah is saying, no. The Lord's saying to Jeremiah, he says, them prophets are as wind. In other words, they're false prophets. But the king was listening to the false prophets. And if we had time to get into this morning, what happens is Jeremiah writes all this down, right? And Jeremiah gives it to the king. And the king, he rips it up, throws Jeremiah in these caves underneath the city because he doesn't want to listen to Jeremiah. And Jeremiah's servant has to rewrite the scroll of Jeremiah because the king would not listen. He even tore up the words, even destroyed the words of Jeremiah the prophet because he didn't believe what Jeremiah was saying. He was listening to all the false prophets who were saying, the Lord will not destroy Judah. The Lord's going to protect Judah. Whatever you do is going to be good because God's on our side. So Jeremiah's saying, that's not true. You've dealt treacherously with me. But they're saying, listen, they've lied. The prophets have lied about the Lord and said, not he. Misfortune will not come on us. We will not see a sword or famine. That's what the false prophets are telling the king of Judah. We won't see a sword or famine. That's not going to happen to us. And so Jeremiah says, but Lord God, I said, look, the prophets are telling them, you will not see the sword, nor will you have a famine, but I will give you lasting peace in this place. Then the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying falsehood in my name. I have neither sent them, nor commanded them, nor spoken to them. They are prophesying to you a false vision, divination and futility, and the deception of their own minds. Therefore, says the Lord, concerning the prophets who are prophesying in my name, although it was not I who sent them, yet they keep saying, there will be no sword or famine in this land. By sword and famine those prophets shall meet their end. The people also to whom they are prophesying will be thrown out into the streets of Jerusalem because of the famine and the sword. There will be no one to bury them, neither them nor their wives, nor their sons, nor their daughters, for I will pour out their wickedness on them. So Jeremiah is saying, these prophets are going to die, but the very thing they're saying is not going to happen to them. They're false prophets. I haven't spoken to them, nor have I told them it's a false vision. Don't listen to them. But yet the king of Judah is listening to them. Why? Why is the king of Judah listening to those prophets and not Jeremiah? Why do people listen to false prophets? What they want to hear. Exactly what the king of Judah wanted to hear. Right? And if he had 100 false prophets telling him, oh, it's going to be good, right? And you got one little old Jeremiah out there saying, oh boy, it ain't going to be good, right? And who's he listening to? He's listening to who he wants to listen to, the ones that are saying, no, you surely won't be destroyed. And so surely at the command, back in the Kings, it came to Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done. For the innocent blood which he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not forgive. Now the rest of the acts of Joachim and all he did are not written in the book of Chronicles of the Kings. So Joachim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiakim, his son, became king in his place. So now we get down to this point, another shift in kingship. He didn't see this befall him, but it's going to happen. There's three basic sieges of Jerusalem. The first one was what we just read about. It's where the king comes down and he says, and he just takes the tax, the Egyptians are gone. And the second time he's going to come down, he's going to come down and he's going to come to get the tax they weren't paying because now they've revolted, right? They said, we're not going to pay the tax anymore, revolted against them. We're not going to bow down to the Babylonians. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to come back. He's going to exact that tax from them. And then the third time he comes back, he's going to come back. He's going to destroy the whole city. So there's actually three different times the Babylonians are going to come to Jerusalem over the course of this discourse before 586 when Jerusalem actually falls to the Babylonians. So, boy, that's a lot of talking. You probably don't have any questions, do you? I don't know if I could answer them, to be honest, but I'd try real hard. It's kind of interesting. You kind of say, at the same time, you kind of say, well, what difference does it make, to us? Well, it shows God. It shows that, injustice won't prevail forever. God will eventually exact his judgment. It took a long time for Judah, long time, longer than Israel, but yet God did that. I think it shows a lot about the world, evil in the world, and that even good nations, even good people, there's evil, but yet a good person like Hosea the king can make a tremendous difference, can he? Even one person can make a tremendous difference in things. But, God is going to preserve Judah because of his promise to David, right? We forget that sometimes. God could have just destroyed them altogether. He could have wiped them from the face of the earth. I mean, he would have had every right to do that. They were absolutely not worth saving, right? And the only reason that God saved them was because of the promise he made to David. And so it tells us that God is a promise-keeping God. In spite of everything that goes on, everything that happens, God's going to keep this promise. This promise is going to prevail. I think that's a really, really big thing for us to understand. God could have wiped them away, should have. But just because of that promise, just because of that one promise he made to David, that Jesus would come through his lineage on his throne, he preserved that nation, preserved that kingship. You know, it's not just that he preserved the nation, because that's one thing to say, oh, well, Judah comes back. We'll get into that in a couple more lessons. Ezra and Nehemiah, the return to Jerusalem. But the other thing, he didn't just save Jerusalem as a city and as a place for the temple, but he preserved the kingship of Jerusalem. And that's something you see in Kings. You know, all these kings are related. They're all part of that lineage of David. That lineage is never going to be broken, is what it comes down to. Even though they get carried, generally when nations will get carried off other nations, and you see that in Samuel, right? When Israel would take nations, they would always kill the king, right? You'd always kill the king, you'd kill all his lineage. Because you never wanted that lineage, you never wanted that to come back up again. You killed them all. Well, generally that's what nations would do. When they would come in, they would destroy all that kingship because they never wanted that lineage to rise back up. But in this case, because God's promise, God's going to preserve that lineage, and they're going to come back and come that lineage, that kingship, that line of kings will come back to Jerusalem and reign again from Jerusalem. So God's in this all the way. It's just this is God's way to exact vengeance upon a people who would not listen to him. That has not changed. So there's great lessons in this, even though it seems like a lot of history. And the other thing I think is important because it really tells us a lot. It gets us to Christ, you know. It's all part of what gets us to Christ. The captivity of Jerusalem is such a big event in Jewish history. Matter of fact, most of the fasts of Jesus' time were fasts that didn't exist at the time of this captivity. They're fasts that came into existence because of the captivity. The return to Jerusalem, fasts that came into existence because of this event. This is such a pivotal event in the Bible. The destruction of Jerusalem is such a pivotal event. If you look at the mountain of prophecy we have right here compared to everywhere else, it's ridiculous. You know, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, those guys are that's all about this. You know, all these minor prophets, Habakkuk and Zephaniah, and most of the minor prophets are about this time in history. They're all right here. Ezekiel, well, we're about to get to Ezekiel, actually. We'll go a little further. The king of Egypt did not come out of his land again, right? Because he was scared of the Babylonians. He was defending his own land. So Judah was waiting on him to come up and help them, but he wasn't going to do that because the Babylonians had become too powerful. He was more worried about just protecting his own borders. So he wasn't going to come up and try to save somebody else. That wasn't in his interest. He was not going to do that. And that's why he brings this up. The king of Egypt did not come out, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So in other words, Egypt is backed into their borders, you know. He's taken a lot of their, wish I'd have said a map, but he's taken a lot of their, what you call their borderline territories away from them. And they backed in behind these rivers because that's where they could defend. You know, it's easy to defend behind a natural barrier. This is all war stuff, right? So they had backed into that, and they were in a defensive position. They weren't being offensive anymore. They were simply defending their territory. So they weren't going to come back. The reason the writer of 2 Kings tells you this is because he's telling you that despite the idea of the king of Judah that Egypt was going to come out and help them, Egypt was not going to come out of their own borders. They weren't going to risk their forces. They were defensive at this point. So Jehoiakim was 18 years old. He reigned 3 months. You know, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Surprise, surprise. And at that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. This is the second time. So Nebuchadnezzar's coming up, and he's going to siege the city. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came. So Nebuchadnezzar himself is coming up to Babylon by his servants. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king, and he and his mother and his servants, his captains and officials. The king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. So he's going to take the king of Babylon, the king of Judah, captive, and he's going to go in and physically take his tax. Well, where's he going to get that, right? That amount of money. Where's he going to get that amount of booty, that amount of treasure? There's only one place in Jerusalem has that kind of treasure, right? The temple. So he's going to go to the temple, and he's going to physically take his tax from Judah because they didn't give it to him, right? Remember that? The king of Judah says, I'm not going to do the Babylonians anymore. And the king of Judah, he turned away from the Babylonians. So then Nebuchadnezzar comes down himself, and he says, I'm going to go in, I'm going to take it. So he comes in, he takes the king of Judah captive, takes him to Babylon. But listen to what he does. This is really important. He carried the treasure of the house of the Lord, the treasure of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. He's going to take all this treasure, and he's going to carry it back to Babylon. Now, if you've read Daniel, the book of Daniel, and you remember that Daniel, you remember the writing on the wall, right? Remember that story in the book of Daniel? Because the king, what did he drink out of? Y'all remember that story in the book of Daniel? The king was rejoicing, and he drank out of what? Cup from the temple, right? He drank from the cup from the temple, and God had the writing on the wall, your kingdom will not prevail. Remember that? And that's how come that the cup from the temple was in Babylon, because they carried it away right here. They carried all those vessels and all those articles away, and they put them in storehouses, treasure houses in Babylon. And when they did that, eventually the king, which that was, that was before the Medes came in, right? That was a Chaldean king, a Babylonian king. He took the vessels and he drank from them, and there was a handwriting, the finger wrote on the wall, right? And he says, what does it mean, right? You've been weighed in the balance, found wanting. Your kingdom will not prevail. I always think of the Johnny Cash song. When I hear that. But anyway, that's where they come from. All this stuff goes back. And then eventually, we'll get into this in a couple of lessons. Eventually, Ezra and Nehemiah, when they go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, the king Xerxes, the Mede king, he will allow them to take these articles back to Jerusalem. A lot of these articles that weren't destroyed or weren't cut up or melted down, a lot of these articles, the Medes will allow the Jews, Ezra and Nehemiah, to take this stuff out of the storehouse and carry it back to Jerusalem, back to the temple. So it's quite the deal. God even preserved some of those articles by doing this. That he did that. And then it says he came in the city, and he went out. Let's see, where did I get to? Still the same place. Why did I do that? Must have had 2 slides. Did I have 2 slides? Then he led them away into exile, all Jerusalem and all the captains, the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. This is the second time he comes. One of the guys who goes back, he takes, is the prophet, wheel inside of the wheel prophet, Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel. So one of the guys that Nebuchadnezzar is going to take back to Babylon is going to be the prophet Ezekiel. So Ezekiel's coming into play, and Ezekiel is going to prophesy from Babylon, from captivity. Ezekiel's a captivity prophet. Ezekiel's going to actually prophesy from Babylon. He's one of the ones that's carried away. Daniel's carried away. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are carried away. All the smiths, all the people who had value. Nebuchadnezzar's carrying all those people back to Babylon, and he's going to assimilate them into the Babylonian Empire. That's his plan, right? So he's going to take him into exile, the king's mother, the king's wife, his officials, the leading men of the land, all the men of valor, 7,000 of the craftsmen, the smiths, 1,000, all strong, fit for war. And these, the king of Babylon, brought into exile into Babylon. So he carries all the good people off, right? So he stripped the temple. He's carried off the king. He's carried off all the good people. But he hasn't destroyed Jerusalem yet. He hasn't destroyed the temple yet. That'll be the 3rd time he comes back. He hasn't done that yet. When the king of Babylon made his uncle Metatanah king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old, but he became king. So once again, it's another uncle, but it's still the lineage, right? Still the lineage of David. That's never going to break throughout all this. He's going to maintain it. So he sticks another king in there that he wants in there, Zedekiah. At least it's one we can pronounce this time. That's a good thing. So, he reigned 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Surprise, surprise. For though the anger of the Lord For through the anger of the Lord, this came about in Jerusalem and Judah, until he cast him out from his presence, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Surprise, surprise. Right? So once again, right, same thing's going to happen. So he took the king, he took everybody, he took everything, he put Zedekiah in place in Judah, and now Zedekiah is going to rebel against the king of Babylon. You think he would have learned? Jeremiah is telling him not to do it. Doesn't matter, he's going to do it anyway. And Wednesday night, we're going to hear about Zedekiah getting his eyes gouged out and carried off. And still waiting on Egypt. Egypt's not coming. Y'all get that by now? No salvation. Yeah. Yeah, it's about, I would say, I can't tell you exactly, but I'm going to say it's probably about 20 years, 15 years, maybe 15 years in there between all this, maybe a little less than that. Habakkuk was like 606 BC. Jerusalem fell in 586. So there's 20 years between Habakkuk and the actual fall of Jerusalem. So, I can tell you that. But, I think it was, I think it happened slower than what we think, because things were slower back then. Armies moved slower. Is Syria from... No, it wouldn't take a year, but it would probably take a couple of months. It is, shoot, going the wrong way. Here, hold on, I'll try to help you. We just got to go back a long way. There's a lot of slides in this PowerPoint. Yeah, it's a pretty good land area. I mean, between all that, you're looking at, several hundred miles. Well, they do it by messengers, by people that are traveling, fast couriers, fast as it can be, people on horse that carry messages back and forth to the king. Trying to expand his borders, A lot of wealth, right? He knows that Judah's kind of that little thorn in the side. It's kind of like the Alamo, I mean, why didn't, oh, who was the guy that fought at the Alamo? Oh, crud. Mexican. Santa Ana. Why didn't he just go around? You know what I mean? It's just this little bitty hut in the middle of this land measure. Why did he just go around it, right? Because, yeah, but it wouldn't have mattered, He could have just went around it. But it was one of those things. I'm going to go through this. I got to conquer this Alamo before I can go conquer this. And it's kind of this way with Judah, because if you look at this, let me see if I can go back a little more. I don't remember what slides I have here. Yeah. So this is Assyria, right? So this is before. There's Babylon down here, but this isn't the Babylonian Empire. This is before that. This is the Assyrians. And if you look at the Assyrians, of course, Judah, the Assyrians carried off Israel, which was right here, Samaria. They carried off this tribe. But Judah, this little Judah, and here's Egypt, okay? Here's Egypt. This is our river, which now is the Suez Canal. But there's Judah. And then if you go forward to Babylon, there's Babylon, eventually. This is the furthest reaches of the Babylonian Empire. So this is later than where we're at in our text, because at this point, they've got Egypt too. So, but Jerusalem's right here. It's kind of the Alamo between here and here. It's just like we're going to take that. But you can see Babylon, I want to say, and I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm going to say that's about 500 miles between Babylon and Judah. It's a big distance. It's a pretty good trip. Maybe not quite that far. You see, that's where, Jonah went to Nineveh, right? When Jonah was thrown out at the sea, and Jonah went to Nineveh, which is where the Euphrates and the Tigris come together, right there somewhere. And Jonah was thrown out of the Mediterranean. He had to go all the way across there to go to Nineveh. So, the whale didn't just spit Jonah up at the, gate of Nineveh. Jonah just said, "Oh, I'll go to Nineveh." Jonah had to walk away to get to Nineveh. So there's a pretty good distance, but I mean, they traveled, armies traveled, and they just, and I mean, just like they did, and they took. It is kind of impressive, the territory, the amount of territory they took. I've often thought about that and tried to control, but that was eventually generally their downfall, is they couldn't control those outlying areas as well as they could. That's what happened to the Romans, right? The Romans, the Romans. This is the would be the next empire, the Medes, who are going to come down and take over the Babylonians. And the Medes all the way from India, all the way through Egypt. Huge empire, the Medes. And then, of course, you're going to have the Romans. And the Romans, well, this is Alexander the Great. The Greeks, the Greeks even bigger under Alexander the Great. But they never really went, the Greeks never really went up into Europe, Italy. But the Romans, on the other hand, are not as worried about India. They're not as much about India and all this over here, but they definitely go to over here to the Atlantic, all the way up through Europe into the Atlantic. And eventually the Romans are going to be taken over, are going to be divided because of the Gauls, right? The Mongols are going to come down, swoop down on them from this direction, divide the empire, and then we'll get into some church history. That'll make more sense as we start talking about Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism and that split, the Great Schism, all that kind of comes. Yeah, but it's huge. It's a huge thing, these empires in huge areas. And like you say, Carla, I was thinking last night, actually laying in bed thinking last night, I thought, how hard would that be? I mean, today we can, in an instant, we can know what's going on. But it could actually have been weeks or months before they might have heard what was going on in an outlying area and be able to respond. It would take a long time. And that's what the success of the Romans, right? That's how come the Romans built all the roads. And that's how come they were so successful, because they could move their military. All roads lead to Rome, and Roman roads still exist. Their roads were so good, and they would, and that's one reason they were so successful, because they had such a network of roads. They could actually get different places, and information got to them quicker. So yeah, it was a huge deal for sure. Oh, thanks for your time this morning. We're out now. All right.